Welcome, or welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by ARCAT. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is JP Emery, Principal at Ankrom Moisan Architects. JP has over 16 years of experience in architecture as a designer, project architect, and principal in charge, with a focus on senior living, including independent living, skilled nursing, assisted living, and memory care. He has led architecture and consultant teams through the development of complex wood podium and high-rise buildings throughout the Puget Sound region. All of his major projects have involved addressing community and design review input to achieve consensus and approvals. The project we are chatting about today is the Aegis Living Lake Union in Seattle, Washington. The 73,000 square foot, 6-story assisted living community boasts 77 units and is the first assisted living community built to meet Living Building Challenge 3.1 Petal Certification. Inspired by the historic rowing clubs and culture of the area, the exterior exhibits natural cedar siding and rough brick. The surrounding landscaping has been thoughtfully curated to consider biodiversity and rainfall. Now, let's get into the details. JP, welcome to Detailed. How are you today?
I'm good, Cherise. Thanks. It's nice to talk with you.
You as well. I'm especially happy that I get to have somebody back here from Ankrom Moisan, which is my former employer.
Yeah.
About 6 or 7 years ago. I always love to get all the friends in the house. That's especially fun. We're going to jump right in. I always start every episode with an icebreaker question, and apparently, on the day that I was writing up your questions, I was in a mood. So the question for you today is, the zombie apocalypse is coming. What 3 famous people must you absolutely have on your team, and why?
Well, Cherise, to answer that question, I got to ask you, are you a zombie fiction fan? I mean, is that a prompt there for a reason?
Absolutely not. I just
Oh,
look
really?
for icebreaker questions that I
Okay.
think will entertain me to hear the answer to.
Okay. I guess I'm maybe like a minor enthusiast, and I think the underlying result is always death. It's kind of a grim question, at least sort of the way that I read it. And so, and a horrible death too, really. I mean, encounters with zombies are seldom good. So I think that my approach to this is maybe to accept that fate, and maybe have a little fun or come to peace with it in advance. So
and not call in backup.
this is not a survival strategy at all. So my answer is a little bit fatalistic in that way. So I guess you didn't specify if the people had to be alive or dead. This is sort of a fantasy question.
Right.
Anyway.
No, it doesn't matter.
So I think the answer is about like coming to peace with death. So I think there's like meditation and spirituality there. So Alan Watts would be kind of my spiritual guide. It's a famous kind of guy who brought Zen teachings to the West. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I haven't.
Have you seen Jiro Dreams of Sushi? That's a kind of a popular movie about a sushi chef in Japan.
I did. It's been quite a while, but I have seen that.
Wonderful movie. So I'd say him for food, Jiro Ono for food. So we've got spirituality, we've got food, and then I think maybe the best choice in a zombie apocalypse is to die suddenly and accidentally, as opposed to actually being caught. So Alex Honnold, the free solo guy, he's the sort of the famous climber who questionably, he has incredible skills, but seems to questionably choose to make climbs, without safety ropes. I know that's a sport, but anyway, I'd love to learn from him. And hopefully I might fall and die as opposed to being eaten alive. So I think that's so there's my zombie apocalypse strategy.
I absolutely love the thought and effort you put into that question. I also saw the Free Solo movie, and I have never been more tense
Oh my God.
throughout an entire
Yeah.
movie. Watch, and obviously I knew he was going to live, but it didn't
Yeah.
matter. Just watching him climb that, I, I personally don't get it. So no Chuck Norris then.
Yeah, no Chuck
No Chuck.
Norris. No,
Okay.
no. Like I said, it's not.
Oh,
Yeah, everybody kind of bites it in the end, and no pun intended, in a zombie movie. So I don't know. Yeah,
I that might be my most favorite answer to one of my icebreaker questions ever in the history of this podcast so far.
well,
That one's
thanks,
that one's going in our history books.
thanks. Hopefully, we can keep up that energy for the rest of the interview.
Oh, I am counting on you now.
All right, all right.
The bar is really high now. So we'll actually get down to business, although I'm going to be laughing all the way through now. We already read your official bio in the
Sure,
intro. So briefly, tell me why you have a focus on senior living type of facilities. Is there a passion
sure.
behind that?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit of the why, and I think like for most people or many people, you find yourself doing something that you never necessarily set out to do. So when I was originally hired by Ankrom Moisan, my first role as a recent college graduate was to perform construction administration services on a project called the Mirabella Seattle. So that's for Pacific Retirement Services. It's about 350 units. Regrettably, I punched every single one of those units
Oh, I'm
early in
sorry.
my career. I know, but I got really good at it. Although I will never forget the woman who taught me how to do punch listing. Was very detail oriented. It was, check the panel gaps on every cabinet, um, and and she was I couldn't have learned it from a better person. And so anyway, so that's my introduction to senior housing. I had no particular interest in it in the beginning of my career, and frankly, when I learned that I would be doing that full time for years, I wasn't that excited about it. But what has kind of kept me there is a few different things. I think one is that it's a growing need. And so, from the perspective of how do I serve society in my career in a way that's meaningful, we have an increasing number of folks who are aging into these kinds of communities. And that's really going to surge over the next decade. And so, I think just from that perspective, it's interesting and relevant. Additionally, I enjoy the challenge of it. There's a really sensitive population here with a variety of different needs. It's not homogenous as a group. And I think it's also not homogenous in the sense that no one wants to think of themselves as a senior citizen, I suspect. And yet you find yourself there, and that occurs in a number of different ways. It can be dementia, it can be disability, but it can also be, affinity groups. It can be kind of new opportunities for fun and enjoyment. And so these communities are really varied and quite fascinating in that way. And they're also very complicated, which I like. It's just sort of, from a challenge perspective, how do you make these buildings work? And then I think the last thing I'll sort of say that keeps me interested is there's a large group of caretakers that sometimes gets forgotten when we're talking about seniors housing. But, for example, there's maybe an average of 3 employees per assisted living resident, right? Because they're working in shifts over the course of a 24-hour day. And that's really fascinating. I mean, this huge army of people who are providing care services, and they're often living very far away from these communities. The wage rates can be varied, but often low, particularly for the entry level positions. And so it's interesting. You've got this huge demographic trend of seniors aging, and then also this labor issue that I think we all feel now is like a result of COVID, but actually has been a trend for many, many years. I got to give credit to GSI and David Knight for that knowledge. But really, the same labor issues we're facing in construction, we're facing in senior living. So there's a lot of interesting challenges here.
Well, and those labor issues are only going to get worse
Well,
as
that's exactly right.
these generations are massively shifting right now.
Agree.
And by 2030 is when it all really hits a wall.
Yeah, that's around then should be about the peak. That's right.
Right. Well, I can guarantee you that if and when I ever, I'll never be a senior citizen, but if and when I end up living in one of these places, they're going to need about 10 staff members for me. I can promise that. I'm going to be the one they're going, darn it, she escaped again. Somebody go find her.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Aegis Living Lake Union.
Sure.
Can you start by telling me what kinds of unique things need consideration during design of any type of senior living facility that we might not normally think about in a different kind of building?
Sure. I would start kind of with the flow of people. That's a common feature, I suppose, in any building, but it is, a very interesting one in senior living. So you have visitors, you have the residents, you have the staff that we've already kind of talked about, and then you have vendors. And a lot of times the operators would like those different flows not to directly interact, particularly, let's say, vendors with visitors, right? And so a building only has so many sides, and so you have to, consider how will you make all of those things kind of sing without crossing. That goes for flow of materials too. There's a soiled laundry. There's food being prepared and then disposed of. There's just regular kind of solid waste issues, and then medical supplies. So, there's a substantial kind of inflow and outflow, both of stuff and people in these communities. The next complexity is acuity. Now, Aegis Living Lake Union specifically has two primary acuities, memory care and assisted living. Other communities also may have independent living or active adults. So you may have, 4 different populations being served. And depending on how those things are being marketed, you may see that some independent living communities would like for those residents not to directly interact with memory care residents.
Right.
I think it's sort of interesting. We don't want to necessarily see where we might end up next, and so again, separating and meeting the needs of each of those acuities is critical. And just to that point I made about maybe not wanting to see what the future might hold out of sort of fear a little bit, is that first impression or sales walk. And I think, Aegis is very savvy in this way that they are making a important first impression, both from the outside and in the moments as you walk in the door and first interact with a member of their staff. And it really is a critical part, because particularly for care-based communities, which Aegis is exclusively assisted living and memory care, they have, a higher resident turnover than an apartment building or independent living. And so, they have to sell pretty often. And that experience, appealing both to perhaps the adult who has need, but also especially the family member, often a child, who is making a decision about where their loved one is going to be living. And so that sales design is a huge aspect of these communities. And then amenities, I think we've probably all been in one of these communities. There could be a pool, there's always a dining room, there could be a theater, there's a wide variety of offerings there. And so fitting those programs into the building is very interesting. And then there's a lot about kind of accessibility, colors, textures, what can seniors perceive better or worse. what's safe, what's not, you know, places to rest. There's a whole laundry list of things. So they're really quite interesting in that way because there's not a shortage of design problems to solve.
I think my first kind of aha moment, I have not worked on a lot of senior living facilities, but I have worked on a
Mm-hmm.
few. My first aha moment years ago was talking about slip resistance and
Mm,
slopes.
yes,
Obviously, you are maybe not as agile as you used to be when you get older.
right.
And there was just this different focus on those items, way more than I'd ever seen. It was probably the first assisted living facility I ever worked on. And I just really hadn't thought about that, that there were these design considerations
Yeah.
that you would address that in any building, but only to a certain level. And even the tiniest slope can make it more difficult for somebody that's not as mobile to
Well,
walk, and
and
and falling issues is a big deal.
it's astonishing to think about if you haven't thought about it when you get there to think about how a single fall can lead to mortality so quickly.
Right.
That there's such a strong correlation between those two things. But that's the reality of a aging population is you really are trying to protect people um, to extend their lives and their and the positive experience of that extended life.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because the other piece was handrails everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
There were these handrails everywhere. You would never do that in a regular building,
Right.
but you're right. Those things matter to the quality of the life they have while they're there as well. And it's already stressful, typically for most families making that move
That's right.
uh, without worrying about being safe.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of leads to my next question. I have volunteered in senior living facilities in the past, just to go visit with people and talk, and people who don't maybe have visitors or have someone to talk to. And I also had an aunt who was in a memory care facility for years,
Mm-hmm.
years, a really long time. Neither of those places were very warm or inviting places. So when I read the project description that you sent me, I really love that right out of the gate you mentioned bringing together the principles of beauty and elements provided solely for human delight. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that jumped off the page for me with my
Yeah.
history and background of being in these types of facilities.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. It's a great question. Um, I think you know, we're seeing a long trend in the recognition needing to provide a comfortable residential setting. This is somebody's home for a long time. Perhaps it's the last home that they'll live in. And so we want that to be, a wonderful place to live. What's really interesting is how well that fit with the Living Building Challenge. So I think that's probably in your introduction, but the Living Building Challenge certification, Petal certification, is a big part of the design of this project. And one of the petals, which are sort of their certification categories,
Right.
one of the petals is beauty. And that's one of the ones that the team selected. And I would say that's because it aligns so well with what we're already trying to do in senior living. But it is really nice to have a sustainability certification that acknowledges beauty and allows us to even emphasize more the value of that. I think that embedding design features that are there just for pleasure, for delight, is kind of a recognition of I think fundamental kind of human characteristics. We all care about what our haircut looks like or how our clothes look. Beauty in architecture is also often thought of as a luxury, but I think especially in a residential setting, it's not a luxury. It's a part of life, and it doesn't always have to be a cost ad. It can be the same materials executed in a wonderful way. One of the primary themes, I think you were also expressing in the intro, so I won't repeat it, but the rowing aesthetic and its relationship to the water and to Lake Union that this project site is near. And so a lot of the beauty comes from designing material features in a way that evoke motion through the water, or through oars through the water, or boat building, joinery techniques, that kind of thing. And I think that's really interesting because we could have employed those same materials just in a very plain way, in a regular grid kind of way or something like that. But, adding this thematic beauty to the way we've executed it is, it's delightful, and it makes it more fun for everybody to do. Yeah, I think the other kind of part of it there is the biophilic aspect, which we might get into a little bit more. Providing kind of green features around the building and inside the building. Those are there, really to delight and to make it a more comfortable place to live in.
Well, I have to say that when I looked through the pictures of this project, it was a very warm and inviting space, which has not been my experience in the places that I visited. I mean, some were fine. It's not that it was bad, but you guys really went above and beyond. And we have a couple questions coming up to address a couple of those things. But
yeah,
I was like, okay, if I have to live in some kind of environment like that at some point in my life, I would live here.
Yeah.
And that says a lot, because most of I've told my kids, if I ever get to that point, just kind of throw me off the bridge. My experience with these places have not been, you don't want to be a burden to your children, but you look at some of the places I visited, and some of those places were horrible. And
that's true.
And it's like, nope, don't want to do this. Have zero desire to have this experience. It does make a difference. I noticed that this building faces a busier street, but is also right in the middle of a neighborhood. Why was this site a challenging location?
It's a great question. It's interesting. The street and the neighborhood are things that actually make the site great. Those are sort of actually not challenges, but assets. So the building is already on a pretty good transit service line, and that street in particular, the front street, East Lake, should see a streetcar service in the future in City of Seattle, as well as a dedicated bike lane being installed in front of it. And so that connectivity is really good for seniors. It's good for their visitors and for the staff. So, that street in and of itself is a pretty good thing. It also happens to be, part of a long, steep slope that it sits in the middle of, which is great for views. So those things are kind of assets. The neighborhood that it's in, East Lake, is one of Seattle's oldest neighborhoods. So the homes and the older buildings there have a really nice identity that is really helpful. We try to, especially with Aegis in particular, design a contextual response, and having an interesting context is very rewarding to draw from. The challenge of this site really comes also from one of the benefits I just talked about, which is that slope. So an incredibly deep hill cut in order to accommodate particularly below grade parking and access that below grade parking, very challenging. Building near other neighbors who have enjoyed views as a result of the site and the slope behind this. And that's such a challenge in Seattle because, views are not a legally protected aspect of one's property, but it is, and I can relate to it. It's very challenging as a property owner for someone else to come in and design something new that blocks your view. But I think the reality is that part of the sustainability goals and the long-term social goals of assisted living and of this project is increasing density within neighborhoods. So, I think that sacrifice was something that was sort of part of the design review process that was a challenge. The soil conditions are very poor as well. So there's a lot of drainage issues associated with that deep cut. And then finally, a zoning envelope that honestly made the project almost almost a failure in the beginning. So I think I don't know how deep we'll get into it, but participation in the Living Building program was part of City of Seattle's Living Building pilot program. So that was a partnership between ILFI, the certification agency, and City of Seattle to motivate developers to adopt Living Building Challenge as a very high bar for sustainability. And in adopting that, Aegis got a little bit of flexibility and some additional height. And I think that was an incredibly positive and forward-thinking move on really Aegis's part and also City of Seattle, because I think the public gets sort of better buildings out of it, and it gives the developers more than just a. I mean, it would be nice to do things just because of our values or just because of our goals for the environment. But the reality is that this building was substantially, on a percentage basis, much more expensive to achieve. Those sustainability features, particularly at the higher level, are quite expensive. That's the reality right now. Right. And so for City of Seattle to motivate for that to happen and actually made this project viable, I think it's an excellent achievement from all parties in that way.
I love that they have an incentive like that, because we all know we have to do a better job with our buildings, period.
Agreed.
We all know that. And it is, at least at this point in time, it is more expensive typically to do that. But to, I would assume that there was a little balance there in with Aegis meeting that incentive, but they also got more space.
Yes.
Which obviously creates more income down the road.
More value, correct.
Yeah, so spend it up here to make this more healthy, sustainable building, and we'll give you some extras so you can make it back in the long run. I think that's really a fantastic, genius way to kind of approach that with builders and developers.
I tend to agree.
Yeah, we might need to be spreading that around a little bit more, because I think that's a fantastic idea.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get a little bit more technical. Let's start with the exterior of this building. I personally love the combination of brick and wood that you have on the outside of this building. Talk to me about the design of the site and the exterior of the building, some of your material choices, and, kind of paint a verbal picture for me. If my eyes were closed, I could picture it by the time you're done telling me about it.
We're on a podcast, huh? So I gotta describe it to the listener. So at the base of the building, the first two levels, there's a dark brick color. And brick is a pretty common feature, particularly in East Lake and some of the older buildings. And so one of the reasons it's employed in that way is a reference to other buildings in the neighborhood to help it fit into the context. And additionally, I think that, we sort of divided the building. It's not unusual to have a tripartite scheme. I wouldn't say that's exactly what's happening here, but we sort of divided the building into this lower heavy base, a middle, and that receives the Western red cedar cladding. That's the reference to boat building and to boat houses. And then the very top it tries to be as glassy as possible, that very topmost level, which is, sort of connecting you to the sky a little bit. And so at all of those different levels, we are trying to achieve something functionally as well as in reference to concept. So at the lower levels, that brick is employed in some detail strips in a herringbone pattern, which is a motif that occurs throughout the building. We're able to kind of use long rows of herringbone that reference the way that an oar out of a a sweep shell is kind of coming out of the rowboat at a 45-degree angle into the water. in an alternating series. So the herringbone pattern is a really nice reference to rowing in that way. At the middle levels, the Western red cedar, I think that part of that ties to trying to pick natural, renewable, or sustainable materials. So, from a living building perspective, we'd like to choose products that respond to the sustainability criteria. And additionally, there's a wave wall, kind of what we call it as wave wall on the north side of the property, where the shingling of the Western red cedar kind of undulates up and down like a wave. Is a really interesting detail. Again, that kind of relates back to that rowing and lake activity kind of thing. And then the very top of the building, one of the more controversial features from a design review perspective is the giant overhanging roof. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, drama is always nice in architecture. So, a giant overhang that makes you a little sort of like, well, how is it standing there? Kind of, that drama is exciting. But also, really, this is one of the great challenges of sustainability in a way in a dense environment is you'd like to generate power on site, but there's a real disconnect between the amount of solar power you can generate on your roof on a very tall building, which doesn't have as much roof as a low, wide building. And so that giant overhang is a interesting opportunity just to claim a little more solar power as well. That's kind of in a nutshell, I think the exterior experience, kind of the heavy base, the cedar cladding at kind of the middle of body of the building, and then the lightness at the top.
I love the way that you took like that big overhang. You took this drama
Mm-hmm.
and made it useful at the same time. It's
Yeah.
not just an aesthetic,
Yeah.
but it serves a purpose as well. And that's one of the things that I would love to see more of in some of our more regular everyday buildings is people finding ways to use things we already have in a unique way
Mm-hmm.
to make a more interesting space.
I totally agree. I think we have sometimes forgotten the lessons of traditional architecture. If you look at a old, very traditional form of architecture, you'll often find something that you thought was just pretty, but had a real specific reason for being. I think that's one of the joys of architecture is that marriage of function and beauty.
So let's talk about the interior a little bit. I imagine because of the type of facility this is, that there were a lot of special considerations given to the design of the interior spaces. You have to think about these spaces in a different way for this
Mm-hmm.
community that's going to be living and hanging out in them. Can you describe to me some of the spaces that are a part of this facility and kind of what are some of the unique features
Yeah.
and spaces that you have?
Sure. So we talked a little bit about first impressions and that main lobby, that very first entrance experience is really critical to Aegis. And it's also probably one of the more difficult and interesting technical achievements on the project as well. Because when you're entering at street level through the front doors and you're walking into that main lobby, it's double height, which is great. It's got this huge volume to it, which is very beautiful. And it's very long. And when you're looking at the back, you might kind of not know it, but you're something like 40 feet down from the adjoining property. So the backside of that lobby and the outdoor space behind it is incredibly deep. But so I think, what could have happened is it could have just been a very dark space at the far end. But what happened is we, carved in a very broad light well, big enough to accommodate a maple tree. and to accommodate kind of a basalt themed, sort of a little waterfall and water feature in that light well. And so it really brings in a pretty great light into the termination, into the end point of the lobby, and becomes a focal point. So it kind of turns that, subterranean aspect of the back of the building into more of a feature. And that double height space has a George Pocock rowing shell hanging upside down in the ceiling of the space, which is, fun drama. And one of the little details, if anybody looks at the photos or gets out there, is that there's these sky and water motifs. I forget if I think some of it's paint and some of it's tile. But those sky and water motifs sort of line up with the boat up in the ceiling area, but they're reversed. So the sky is upside down because the boat's upside down. Some of the other, interesting spaces, all of the assisted living common areas, or most of them, are on that ground floor, because what Aegis would like to do is they'd like to see their residents come out of their rooms, go to one place in the building, and have an opportunity to socialize with the other people living in the building, and interact with staff too. And that's difficult to do if you distribute spaces throughout the building. So their philosophy is to consolidate it all in one place. So we've got, a salon, a barbershop, massage, a multi-purpose room, a theater, the dining room, so all of these spaces are on the ground floor, and they're kind of, really squeezed in there. It's a tough footprint, honestly, on this building, but we really did create these really wonderful, intimate, gathering spaces on the ground floor. I'll touch briefly. The dining room is kind of an interesting feature. That's on the front side of the building, adjacent to the lobby, and we have some really large operable windows there that face the street. And so that's an opportunity for, the residents inside and for the people walking by to have an interaction or just be aware of each other. And I think that's always wonderful to achieve if we can. We don't want these to be separate from the community. We want them to be kind of a part of it.
Right.
Yeah. So, that's a quick summary on some of the interior spaces.
What about the living spaces? What's going on there? Like, is it just like a studio apartment, or is it just like a room?
The resident rooms.
Right,
I
the
see.
residence rooms.
Yeah. So it can vary in assisted living. Aegis in particular serves a pretty high acuity. And so they don't provide kitchens in any of their unit. Well, with the rare exception of some really big 2-bedrooms, they will provide a kitchen. But typically they provide just a kitchenette. And that's because most of the population they're serving is kind of past the point of preparing their own meals. They might occasionally reheat something. So they have a little fridge and a microwave. That kind of thing is typical. But in general, they're, receiving all of their meals inside the building. So their units are on the smaller side, if as compared to, let's say, a full apartment, but they're really appropriate. I feel, I would agree with Aegis on this, that they're appropriate to what they're trying to achieve, which is, again, that social interaction. They want the rooms to be comfortable. I would say they are. You think about people have to go in and provide care in those units. And so whether it's a studio or a 1-bedroom, you need to provide enough space around the bed for someone assisting to kind of walk all the way around it. You need to provide a pretty generous bathroom because there's a lot of assisted bathing that might be going on, or maneuvering a wheelchair, walker, that kind of thing. But the focus, I would say, is on, a comfortable but small living space, and then a really huge variety and opportunity of amenities in the building.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to address it too, because it's a known fact. There's probably data coming out your ears to back it up, that as people get older, especially as they become less able to take care of themselves, they can often end up in this position of kind of being alone. And that is not healthy. And people,
Yeah.
it's a known fact that you will die sooner if you don't keep active and you don't keep interactions with people and those kinds of things. So that's a great way to, because older people will sometimes also isolate themselves. But if you
Yeah.
make it so they have no choice, at least some of the time,
Hmm.
to come down and have dinner or, come be a part of something going on in the common spaces, that probably, I would guess, very much helps extend their lives and the quality of the lives that they're living.
I would agree. I think really, life is to be lived with other people. And I think that, I think Aegis's philosophy here is really one geared towards the health of their residents. Okay.
So the very first thing that caught my eye when I was starting to go through the pictures was that gorgeous wood ceiling with a boat. I didn't know what it looked like, a community, some kind of community space. I didn't realize that was right at the entrance. I was trying to
Yeah.
figure out where in the building is this, but just jumped out at me as such a great feature. Tell me about some of the other finishes and materials you used on the interior to make this such a warm and inviting space.
Sure. I think in general, kind of warm colors and textures are common throughout this building. There's a focus on providing non-VOC releasing materials, of course, too, as a result of the sustainability aspect of this project. You have a concern in this population about high contrast. So oftentimes that high contrast can be seen as a change in level. And that's just something that comes with the aging eye. And so, I think it's the appropriate change in color and texture so that you can express different spaces separately, but not stark contrast, which can be disorienting, particularly in the memory care. The carpet has sort of a flowing water feel to it, I would say. I think that's, it kind of, everything here is kind of going back to kind of the lake feel or the rowing feel. You see that herringbone pattern that I talked about on the outside of the building come through in a number of different ways. You see it in the wood ceilings and some of the floors, in the tile as well. Um, we could hold. I have to say, I think our interiors team, had done a really excellent job on the project. And what I would encourage you to do is to invite them onto the podcast in a later episode, and they can give you a full narrative.
And I would love that because
Yeah,
I happen to know personally what a fantastic interiors team Ankrom has. I mean, I
yeah,
remember the first time my first week working there, and it's like, whoa, they're taking interiors to a whole nother level in this company.
yeah,
That was the first time I had ever seen that kind of interiors team and that huge library. And I was there when we moved into the new building. I
hmm,
started in the old building and then moved into the new building. But fantastic interiors team. So I will put that on my
yes.
list because I have not had an interiors focused episode yet.
Oh, that's a great opportunity. I'm really proud on this project of the cohesion in concept between the exterior and the interior. It really is quite unified, and I have to commend our client too for not only sort of keeping and supporting those features, but also building on them with their own furniture and decoration kind of additive to that. It really is a building that has one clear identity, inside and out.
But water's my happy place. So I love the identity of this building.
Yeah.
What would you say? We're going to teach our listeners something right now.
Okay.
What would you say your biggest design challenge was on this? I don't call them problems because this business is nothing but one challenge after another,
Yeah.
no matter what we do. What was your biggest design challenge on this project and how did you solve it?
Sure. It's really specific, but I think there's a broad lesson in it, and that's toilet flushing.
Okay, didn't
So,
expect that one coming.
so we have one of the requirements of the Living Building Challenge is to not use potable water for non-potable uses, and so one of the aspects of that was toilet flushing, and so that means use gray water for toilet flushing. So the first place we went with that was to use rainwater, but the rainwater comes in a specific time in the year in Seattle, and the size of storage that you would need in order to accommodate toilet flushing, and irrigation too, over the whole year is frankly unrealistic. So you can't store that much water on site. So then we looked at the other obvious source of gray water, which would be like shower runoff. And where we ran into the obstacle was not so much in the treatment itself or the, capture of it, but actually the Department of Health. And the Department of Health, in any state, their responsibility first is to the senior population that they're licensing for. And they were really concerned about the health of residents if we were going to employ this feature. And I think, honestly, the first answer was no. That we just couldn't do it, flat out, no. And our sort of ability to partner with the graywater consultant and to partner with Department of Health and also eventually King County, who also had a say in whether this could happen or not. Our ability to work with all of these stakeholders actually, because it is sort of values based, because it was around this idea of long-term sustainability, it was a way of bringing everybody to the table to solve the technical issues associated with it and really change the laws for how we could use water in the building. And where that ended up, and I think we'll see as maybe a commonality in senior living in the future, is that we were able to use gray water for toilet flushing exclusive of the memory care units. So the gray water treatment in this building is, it's sort of 99% of the way to potable water. Obviously, that gap from 99 to 100% is still pretty big, but it's safe enough that whatever sort of aerosol of water is generated from a flush is not a risk to the health of residents. And then in memory care, there's no other way to say this, but like residents may come directly in contact with the toilet water just because of dementia issues, right? And so that's why gray water was kept out there. And then that became a stakeholder agreement with City of Seattle and ILFI that we were able to use potable water for flushing there. So everybody had to really rewrite the rules to achieve this. And I think that is, that's at the forefront of any innovative process, is you've got to turn no's into yeses.
Right. I was sitting there thinking, how is gray water? I spent 6.5 years working in MEP, so
oh, great!
I am familiar with those kinds of systems. I'm like, how's gray water in a toilet a health issue? Yeah. I didn't think about water does. They've done all these studies about how much goes up in vapor in the air that you're breathing or whatever. So I get that piece, and I certainly understand why it probably wasn't the best idea possibly for the memory care unit, but. How great that you were able to move that needle and turn that no into a yes.
Yeah.
Saves a lot of money and, a lot of resources over the long term.
It does. It's a substantial reduction in water use, which is honestly an expensive utility in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And just like anywhere in the world, it's a scarce resource.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm going to combine the next two together.
Sure.
Because I've been kind of waiting to get to this question.
Okay.
So we're going to talk about sustainability for a minute. So what I'd like you to do is tell me, this is a big, long question. Tell me about meeting the Living Building Challenge Petal Certification and participating in the City of Seattle's Building Pilot Program, which I hadn't heard of, and about some of the most notable sustainability features in this building.
Sure. So as we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, there's an incentive associated with participating in the city's Living Building Pilot Program. And so what that required us to do was to get what's called a Petal Certification from ILFI and also meet the City of Seattle sort of specific overlay requirements to the Living Building Challenge. And so that kind of I'll focus on, energy and water here primarily. It also includes the place and beauty measures that we started to talk about a little bit. Those are the more, a little more like qualitative or subjective aspects of the Petal certification that we incorporated in the building. I think we've already been talking about those things, specific to energy and water, we first had to have a 25% reduction in energy use in the building. And we also had to be net zero in terms of energy use. So it's actually quite challenging for a senior community, very energy intensive. And so the first thing was establishing an EUI that we could all agree on. None of the baselines that existed within the standards that were being referenced were for assisted living of this type. And so the first step was to say, well, what combination of baselines is actually reasonable to establish that EUI number? And part of the way we got there was Aegis bringing their own utility measures from other buildings that they had in operation that were in the same code cycle or in the most recent prior. And so then we converted, that data with our energy modeler at PAE into kind of a logical baseline EUI that we could measure from. And then we worked on energy measures that would include, tighter envelope, more efficient appliances, that kind of thing, to bring down to a 25% reduction, in which there was, almost no buffer on by the time we were able to get there because, frankly, it's just a high energy building. And so that's what it's kind of designed to meet. And then from the net zero perspective, I kind of spoke about the broad roof and the amount of solar arrays. Well, we had to fit a lot of mechanical equipment up there too. Even without it, it's not enough roof to provide net zero. And this was another kind of rule change. So what ILFI allowed for urban sites was to provide offsite power. But the rule is that the company doing development, so Aegis, would have to actually operate that solar facility long term. And that aspect of it was sort of not really feasible. What was feasible was for them to pay for the long-term development of it and incorporate it. So they actually found a property partner who was building a warehouse, and that warehouse then received Aegis's sort of financed solar generation within the same sort of utility network. And so that array plus the array that's on the building equals out to the net zero. But I think that's the kind of, creative solutions that are going to be required. There are certainly examples like the sustainable, I think it's called SLI. I forget what the acronym. Sustainable is the first letter. It's the high-rise and mid-rise system that's been designed by Collins Werman in partnership with with a structural engineer I can't think of right now. And it's a kit of parts high-rise system with integrated solar generation, kind of that goes all the way up. And we've seen that in curtain wall systems and things like that too, right? Like integrated solar can be a large part of a lot of buildings, but I still think that it's not realistic for all building types at all times to be able to generate all the power they need on site. And so I think programs like this, where you can, generate power where it makes sense physically, and then that contributes to the overall sustainability of the project, makes a lot of sense.
Well, I love that you're out there kind of going, okay, you have a rule, let's change it. so we can do good things. It's not just change it because I want to do this.
No,
I want to solve the problem.
This was the first one. This was the first assisted living project in the world to go after this certification. And I think, if you believe that the Living Building Challenge is maybe the most stringent sustainability standard, maybe, may not be, we don't have to argue, but it's certainly very challenging. And so arguably, this is the highest performing assisted living project, of its type in the world. So I think we really had to challenge those rules. It was the only way to make it feasible. And I think it was, so you back up to what is the intent of the rule, and then you can figure out how to solve it rather than how is the rule written.
Just because now I work for an enclosure consultant now.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to know, what'd you do in your envelope? What'd you do to meet these sustainability goals?
Sure.
Pure curiosity.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that is so funny about high performance buildings is that the envelope is such a place of diminishing returns. We already have a really stringent energy code in Washington. And so your baseline for insulation and window performance is pretty high. And you can spend a lot more money to get a little bit further down that road. But it is not moving the needle a ton in your energy performance. Now, it's necessary, of course, in order to get that reduction. But I don't think you'll find, I think this is an excellent building envelope, but I don't know that it's got anything that's going to shock anybody. It's got, triple pane, gas-filled windows, of course. It's got pretty substantial exterior insulation in addition to the cavity insulation, high R value roof, exceptionally high levels of air tightness measure. I think I could be speaking out of turn here, but I'm pretty sure it's, close to or within the passive house kind of standard of air leakage. But honestly, those things we would have been pretty close to those things on a baseline Washington State Energy Code building. There would have been a little less exterior insulation. Maybe it would have been double pane. But in terms of the overall performance of the building, it's a very, very small part of achieving what we achieved.
Well, one of the nice things is not all of our listeners are in Washington.
Well, sure.
or in states that have that stringent of requirements, or even in the United States.
Yeah, sure.
And, so it's like, maybe I'll try that.
Yeah.
Or hopefully maybe inspiring
other
states to set higher standards and just make that the status quo.
I think exterior insulation can have for load dominant climates where you have a heavy cooling or heating load and you really want a high R value envelope. The exterior insulation it really is an important part of performance. And so I think, getting more out of the cavity and into the exterior is a key part of that. And then once you've gone a certain way on that, then the only thing you can look at in a way is your windows. And, it's funny, even in the vinyl products, there's some pretty awesome triple pane options that are really not that much more expensive. That cost is coming down a lot in the last few years.
Well, that's good to hear, because maybe that will motivate more people to do it.
Yeah.
So we always learn at least one lesson during construction. There is no such thing as a perfect construction phase on any building. There are challenges just like in every other phase. Tell me briefly about what one lesson you learned during construction on this building.
Yeah, this one's coordination. Aegis and Ankrom Moisan had successfully delivered a lot of assisted living projects together before Aegis Lake Union. And I'm on the design side, so I'm always going to say, let's go more with design. Let's do clash detection. Let's model all of the interior MEP elements so we can coordinate them in advance. And, the client would prefer not to double pay for things. And we had mostly been able to coordinate things in the field. And so, why would they want to do the clash detection? I think this project really, more than any other, it just had the density of stuff. It had more stuff because higher performance products often have more stuff, to put it simply. And so a 3D coordinated, clash detection model that could have been developed over a series of months before construction started, I think really could have saved us all some shouting in the construction process, and that I think that to me is the biggest lesson learned. And the more complex the building, I think the whole industry is going towards BIM modeling overall, but it's still amazing to see how little is done in 3 dimensions, and how little we are still, in a world where the way that airplanes and cars are manufactured in a totally 3D pre-designed process, and that buildings are by and large still sort of just winging it in the field to a certain extent. It's amazing, honestly, that we get these things done.
You're preaching to the choir. I don't know how many times I tell somebody, either in one of my classes that I'm teaching or young professionals, that when everybody who knows me knows, one of the things that's going to make my head spin around on my neck is if you say, I don't have time. That little extra time or money up front saves that and 10 times over during construction by wrapping up those things and figuring them out early if you can.
I think once you've seen something built and then demolished and rebuilt, you should be saying to yourself, oh yeah, we could have done this better.
Yeah. Pay attention, listeners. Okay, before we get to our couple of closing questions, what's next for JP Emery and Ankrom Moisan? What are you working on now?
Well, we do have another living building project in the works in assisted living, so that is very exciting. We're still doing a lot of senior living at all scales. I think that senior living is a very broad industry, and so we get to work with for-profit developers. We get to work with large campus nonprofits or multi-campus nonprofits. It's an exciting time for that kind of work, and the boomers, I think, are continuing to redefine what that means and what is expected, and that is quite a lot of fun. In addition, I think that interest rates, at least on the West Coast here, are pushing towards actually slightly lower density building typologies. So we're seeing a slowdown in development. I mean, still some, but a slowdown in development in the urban cores, and a little bit of an increase in development of mid-rise and lower properties in the surrounding communities. So I think that's the trend for us over the next couple of years. I certainly, from a sustainability perspective, and the desire to live car-free as much as possible, that I hope we see that reverse kind of as soon as possible. I think that the city is kind of part of the future of managing our carbon emissions. So but Ankrom Moisan is we're doing, in my sort of world, we're doing a lot of interesting senior housing and multifamily housing projects, and then we're distributed over a lot of other sectors, and so there's a lot of exciting work out there still.
Well, good. That gives me lots of material for the future, because after you answering that icebreaker question, I can promise you will be asked to come back and tell me about another project later.
Only if you continue to ask interesting icebreakers.
Oh, I'll work harder on your next one. I absolutely will after that. Okay. Of course, you have to get through my final questions still.
Yes.
But before the final question, I always like to close out the episode with at least one broader industry question that's not specific to the project, but just about the industry as a whole. And so mine for you is, in general, more broadly, what do you feel are our greatest challenges as an industry to designing more sustainable buildings?
Yeah. I think I would answer that from a perspective of what could be improved. And I think it's this reward question in a way, or incentive question. Why do I want to do sustainable development? And there's a lot of levers coming now from the finance side, which is awesome to see. But as we discussed here, achieving a very high level of sustainability is still a cost add. Now, it may be a cost neutral or negative in the long term because these buildings last longer and are cheaper to operate on a day-to-day basis. So how do we reward the industry, or how do we incentivize the industry to focus a little less on first cost? And I think City of Seattle is honestly a leader in this pilot program, because they have allowed us to create something fantastic like this. So whatever, it doesn't always have to be yield. I know that, there's a lot of NIMBYism out there, and I can respect the fear of density in your neighborhood. People like things how they are. Doesn't always have to be density, although that's a really great lever. I think the cost of permitting, the speed of permitting are other opportunities to turn a lever. I think that jurisdictions should really look closely at how can we incentivize sustainable development, and hopefully then we'll see more of it.
I love that you said that, because I'm hoping all of the architects who listen to this show go running to their local government agencies and say, why aren't we doing this?
Yeah.
Because it's a win-win for everybody. Nobody loses in this. And that's usually when you're trying to solve a problem, somebody's got to give more or take more to get to where you need to go. But this is really a win for everybody in the long run.
I think the only argument that people that argument against it is people are sort of afraid of traffic, or they're afraid of density. Again, I can respect where that fear comes from, but I think the higher value here is honestly reducing carbon emission, and population density is just a part of that.
Yeah, it's just a new neighbor. I mean, you're going to have, I think, that pushback on any building you're putting there, not just assisted living. It could be a restaurant, and you're going to have that same argument.
That's right.
But it could be. I know that if it was going in my neighborhood, number one, I probably wouldn't have an issue with it. But even if I thought I did, knowing that it's going to be a better, healthier building would certainly help sway my opinion.
Yeah. That's right.
And you'd hope more people think like that. Okay. You ready? You ready for the final question?
I am.
Everybody gets this question. So we all hope, we all hope that our involvement in this life will in some way make the world a better place. That's not necessarily some massive thing. Maybe it's little things that you do, or make an impact on the world we live in. For me, I call that personal mission of mine, my world domination statement. And that means my plan to make a difference in this world, not how I'm going to take over the world. Although I wouldn't put it past me, but my plan to make a difference.
Yeah.
So, personal or professional, as an individual, how do you hope to make your mark on this world? What is your personal world domination statement?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think that it is kind of the same answer, whether personally or professionally, and it's about building long-lasting, trust-based relationships with my colleagues and clients. But, personal life, I think, works the same way. Great achievements are built on trust and partnership. This building in particular could have only been done, I feel, as a fifth or sixth project with Aegis Living. We had built a relationship where we understood each other, where we trusted each other. And when we said, how would you like to do something that's completely outside of your comfort zone and nothing like what you've done before, they were willing to go there with us. And so I think that that trust relationship is how great things get done.
I couldn't agree more. JP, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been absolutely delightful.
Well, thank you.
I hope you'll come back and talk to me about another project at some point. And
yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, Cherise, this was great. I had a great time. Really fun to talk to you. Thank you so much.
You're always welcome. Thank you.